Okay, guys. So to follow up here from where we were talking about yesterday. So if you remember yesterday, or in our last lesson, we were talking about how in 1842, Commonwealth versus Hunt essentially made unions in the United States legal. And a union is just a group of workers who join together for the purposes of bargaining as a group. And Commonwealth versus Hunt said that unions were okay provided that they were legally chartered and that they did things in a legal means to achieve their goals. And that this did not sit well with ownership. And that through fear and through um, connecting dots, owners did a good job of convincing people that the unions themselves were all tools and part of a vast conspiracy to overthrow the government and to ruin America. So let's follow up with that today and make two connections on the last couple of points from yesterday's lessons. Number one, why the fear mongering? Why all the effort to demonize workers who join together? Creating this atmosphere of fear and really stoking the idea that workers were going to overthrow America. Like any conspiracy, there is truth to some degree in it. But it's also a way to maybe shift direction from other things. In this particular case, what the owners were doing really diverted people away from the reality of why it was that unions were being created in the first place. There were horrible situations that needed to be addressed. There were real problems. Workers felt like they were being taken advantage of. The wages were bad. I mean, really bad. Part of the problem is that up until after the 1876 World's Fair, industry in America really wasn't overly prominent. I mean, you could make the argument even that the Civil War ushered in a greater form of industrialization, and that's a reasonable argument. I think there's a lot of things to be said there. But it's only after Reconstruction ends, when industry begins moving into the South as well as being in the North, and you really have this demand for American industrial products, that work opportunities really open up. So this is a long about way of saying that there were more people looking for work than there were jobs. That means if we really look at the full idea of a hands-off laissez-faire approach, that basically the wages are dictated by demand. And we'll talk about this later on in this section about the idea of supply and demand and how that fits in with labor. But wages were bad because wages were already low. And when more people, especially immigrants, came in, which is the second part of what we ended up with yesterday, the last lesson, when immigrants come in and they're looking for work, you have even more workers for less jobs. And it suddenly becomes, well, we'll hire you if you're willing to take even less than this guy would. So there's one thing, low wages. Second thing, bad working conditions. The machinery at the time was dangerous. There were no safety standards. There were no protocols for inspections or anything else. People were having body parts removed by machines. They would be permanently crippled or paralyzed. In some cases, they would be killed. The environments themselves were unhealthy and unsanitary in many cases as well. Long hours. Keep in mind, the average work week now for America is an 8-hour day, 5 days a week, or a 4-day week of 10 hours a day. It's a 40-hour work week. Average work week, 60 to 80 hours back then, 6 days a week. So you're looking anywhere from a 10 to 14-hour work day, 6 days a week. And the issue of children. Kids as young as 5 were being put to work full time. And I'm not talking about like, go get me a glass of water, kid. I'm talking about this little dinky mine shaft is too small for an adult to get in, but we can put a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old in a bucket down there. They fill the bucket up and we keep them down there for hours while they just keep filling the bucket up over and over again. Kids were dying in these jobs. And in some cases, they're being paid pennies an hour. These were issues that needed to be addressed. And this is what unions had formed to deal with. But as long as you could convince people that unions were actually about overthrowing the government, it really removed these problems from people's view. Now, again, as I started off talking about, at the heart of every conspiracy is some degree of truth, greater or lesser. So we already talked about how um, the Illuminati had been a real group, and they made their goals very clear of destroying and abolishing all religion and all government, and having a small group of wealthy aristocrats take over, who would govern everybody in this sort of like utopia of the brotherhood of man, as they called it. Those Illuminati were also, we talked yesterday, the people who the survivors of the great Illuminati wipeout in the early 19th century were some of the people who got together and paid Karl Marx to publish his Communist Manifesto and to write out their ideas. So here's the real irony of this. It's a group of very wealthy people who are proposing the idea that there should be a revolt of the poor against the rich. So, how does that make any sense? Because it goes down to this, and if you really look at the way the modern politics runs, it's not that dissimilar. The idea that there is a certain group of people who should be allowed to run everything, control everything, and keep what they have because they simply know better. They're the enlightened or illuminated ones who know what's best for society. So the Marxist ideas really caught on in Europe among the poor working class. This is more true in the areas of Central Europe than anywhere else, places like Austria and the German states and France and parts of like near Eastern Europe that were bordering on those areas, where there was some degree of industry, where there were things like mines or logging facilities or whatever else, and workers were being treated horribly. And there was widespread poverty, and there were very few people who were getting super rich off of the efforts of everybody. And it worked out beautifully according to Marxist philosophy because you had this large group of oppressed people who were victims. Remember, it's the whole idea of critical theory is that there's victims and there's oppressors. The victims were the workers, or as Marx called them, the proletariat. The oppressors were the capitalist business owners, the bourgeois, and their lackeys, their trolls, their toadies, the managers, the slave drivers, if you will. Well, in Europe, these Marxists basically took control of unions and they got the unions riled up. So, as it's not a coincidence, in 1848, when Marx's work is finally published as a book outlining these ideas that he was paid to write, the Communist Manifesto, there are revolts all over Europe. And I mean real revolts. You have worker uprisings in France, in the German states, in Austria. And Marx is like, look, I was right. Look at this. Holy cow. We got revolutions. It's communist utopia coming. I told you this is what would happen. Well, what Marx didn't tell everybody was going to happen is that the governments ruthlessly cracked down on these people. And these anarchist leaders who had formed or joined these unions fled and got away as quickly as they could. This is where we come back to the immigrant issue in America. These people came to America. Now, it is very important to understand when I'm talking about this. In the 1840s through 1850s, there are two waves of immigrants. The first wave of immigrants are the Irish, who are fleeing famine and what could be argued as um, a purposeful attempt to kill them off by the British government. That's the Great Potato Famine. Those Irish people come to America simply looking for the opportunity to have jobs, to have land, to be farmers or business people or do whatever they could. They came here to get a better life and to escape death, like famine death. Then there's another group. These people are primarily Central Europeans, mostly French and German. They are what I would call political immigrants. Okay, the key here is the word political. Okay, so let's look at here. It's the key here is they are political immigrants. And what do I mean by political? They come to America not because they want a better life, not because they want job opportunities, not because they want a chance to own their own property. They come to America because they are literally running away from the police. They are going to be imprisoned. They are possibly going to be executed. Why? Because their radical political ideologies, their support of Marxism and what is social anarchy, meant that in 1848, when they led these uprisings, they had two choices: go to jail or run away. And they ran away. Where? To America. Why? Because in America, they saw an opportunity. They saw a country that was not governed by a monarchy of any kind. It was, like France, a republic. Well, France-ish, because France was a monarchy too in its own way at that time too. This republic would allow them in the long term to elect representatives who agreed with their positions and slowly but surely, through majorities, change the way that America was from a republic into a full democracy on its way into a communist or socialist nation. This is what they wanted. And when they came to America, these people who were hardcore Marxists, they are social anarchists, which means that they believe in the overthrow of government and the replacement of government with social groups. This is where socialism is different than, like, say, the extreme right, where anarchists are individualists. These social anarchists were better educated, better spoken, and had a more deep, like, view of political ideas than the common everyday American worker or the common everyday immigrant. They naturally gravitated into the unions. They either started them or they joined them, and within a few years, they were the leaders of American labor unions. So there is truth to the fact that there were anarchists in American labor unions. And yes, they did want to overthrow the government. Was it all of them? Were they all tools of the Illuminati? No. They weren't all Marxists. And as we'll talk about in the next lesson, there's some unions in particular, and there's some very interesting reactions to the unions that they develop. But the problem is that this reality that these people did come to America allowed American owners and management to avoid dealing with these problems here with the simple excuse that all unions are looking to, in the end, to overthrow the government. Fixing low wages, bad working conditions, long hours, and child labor, that's one step away from overthrow of America as we know it. And not unlike today, when people are afraid, they'll believe just about anything. Now, to make matters worse for labor unions, in the 1850s and 60s, there was a growing violent confrontation between labor and ownership, culminating and highlighting in the draft riots of 1862, when the Union Army was literally that all of the, like, the papers for the enlistment had run up. and they were going to draft a new group of people. New York City had 3 days of riots because of the draft. Well, that's a military draft. What does it have to do with labor unions? I'm glad you asked. The reason is this: what these anarchists did was they pointed out to all the immigrants and all the union members that the wealthy bougie could pay off the government to not go to war, and they could buy poor people to go into war for them. These riots were the direct result of the influence of these anarchists on unions and immigrants to rise up against what they perceived, rightly probably, as an unfair situation where the rich could avoid military service and the poor were forced into it because of their poverty. The next lesson, we're going to look at unions that actually worked in America. And here's an interesting little tidbit, a little like preview. The first successful big union in America occurs after the Civil War is over, not before or during the war. Okay, so we'll pick this up later. Peace and love.